In this module, we'll be discussing the roles of the Vice President and the First Lady. The role of the Vice President was written into the Constitution by the framers, but the role of the First Lady was not, and these two are closest to the President. Originally, the Vice President was the person who received the second most number of Electoral College votes. Because that meant that the President and the Vice President could be of completely opposing political parties are discussed in Module 3.1, the 12th Amendment changed this. The Vice President simply served as President of the Senate, casting the tie-breaking vote. Recently, Vice President Mike Pence cast the tie-breaking votes on President Trump's nomination of Betsy DeVos to Education Secretary. But this is the first time in history a presidential nomination has been this close, and the Vice President essentially got to approve the President's choice for a cabinet-level position. Vice President Harry Truman was not informed, for example, of the Manhattan Project and the existence of an atomic bomb. So presidents didn't feel the need to keep vice presidents informed. In fact, Truman found out after his sudden succession to the presidency when Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly in April of 1945. The next sudden succession during the nuclear age, when President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, led to the ratification of the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967. It took that long to make it through Congress and through the states after Kennedy's death. The 25th Amendment provides for presidential succession and inability. It has 4 sections. The first one states that upon the death, removal via impeachment, or resignation of the president, the vice president becomes president. If the vice presidency of the United States is vacated, the Constitution now stipulates, Section 2 of the 25th Amendment, that the president must appoint a new vice president with the approval of Congress. And little did the framers of the 25th Amendment know that this would occur within a decade of the ratification of the 25th Amendment, when Republican President Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned. Nixon nominated General Ford, and Ford was confirmed, as per the 25th Amendment, by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. Soon thereafter, Nixon himself resigned the presidency due to the Watergate scandal. This scandal was a break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in Washington's Watergate Hotel. Members of the committee to re-elect the president, with the very apt acronym CREEP, were implicated in the crime. Ford took over as president and nominated Nelson Rockefeller of New York to become vice president. He was confirmed by a majority vote of both chambers. Section 3 of the 25th Amendment states that if the president determines he is enabled, he will notify the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House in writing, and the vice president will act as president until the inability is over. Section 4 also gives the vice president a unique role. If the president is enabled to the point where he cannot inform the president pro tem and the Speaker of the House in writing, the vice president, along with a majority of the cabinet, can do so, and the vice president will immediately act as president until the inability is over. The president would then transmit in writing when the inability was over, and he could resume his duties as president. If the vice president and cabinet disagree and believe that the president is still enabled, Congress would decide the issue. The 25th sets specific time limits for when this would occur, making the 25th the longest and the most complex of all constitutional amendments. Moving on to the First Lady's role, which again is not inscribed in the Constitution. As an advocate of her husband, the First Lady has an interesting role. First Ladies have had increasingly prominent roles in the last 100 years. Franklin Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, was chosen as ambassador to the UN by President Truman. Truman relied on his wife, Bess, for personal decisions, and she chose to remain mostly in Independence, Missouri, rather than spend much time at the White House. President Kennedy's wife, Jacqueline, or Jackie as she was commonly known, spoke French and summered in France as a child. She accompanied Kennedy on a state visit with the French president, Charles de Gaulle. The French president was charmed with her glamour, as were the French people. Kennedy joked that he was simply, quote, the man who accompanied Jackie to France, and that he had enjoyed it. Jackie Kennedy took pride in refurbishing and redecorating the White House, and this was shown as a special on television. Often First Ladies have been assigned a particular role and will have staff to help them fulfill this role. The social office of the First Lady, for example, is located in the East Wing of the White House. And they do all sorts of tasks, including ironing out invitations. Nancy Reagan helped launch the Just Say No campaign against drugs. Hillary Clinton took on health care because in the 1990s, the United States was just the only one of 16 industrialized nations not to have universal health care. The insurance lobbies, or special interests, which are discussed in Module 3.2, they defeated universal health care in the 1990s, and for a while, Hillary Clinton remains behind the scenes, facing a backlash that she had taken an outsized role, too much power for a First Lady. The Office of the First Lady made sure that the very next issue that brought her press attention was not a complicated policy issue. It was her chocolate chip cookie recipe. The next First Lady, Laura Bush, took on a safer or less controversial issue. As a former teacher, she worked on improving childhood literacy rates in the United States. Michelle Obama was a champion of women's rights. She was also the first to plant a victory garden at the White House, for example. Be sure to review this video as many times as you need to and carefully go over your readings and answer the questions.